Sarah stood frozen at the hospital doorway, her chest tightening as the sterile air pressed in. The faint beeping of machines filled the silence, each tone like a countdown to a truth she wasn't ready for. A doctor turned, his expression heavy with the kind of sorrow that crushed hope before words were even spoken. Sarah whispered to herself, "Please, not this," though the plea felt empty in the vast room. The doctor said softly, "I'm sorry, there's nothing more we can do." Her knees buckled, but she clung to the doorframe, refusing to collapse. Her world fractured in that moment, each breath like shards of glass cutting her from within. She wanted to scream, to claw at the walls, to tear the moment apart. But all she could do was stare at the still figure lying in the bed. Memories of laughter, late-night talks, and whispered promises surged into her mind, like cruel reminders of what was being stolen from her. Sarah's trembling hand reached out but stopped short, paralyzed by the finality in the doctor's tone. Tears slid silently down her cheeks, her body shaking as her voice cracked. "How am I supposed to let go?" The walls seemed to close in on Sarah as she stumbled into the room, her breath ragged. The machines hummed softly, cruelly, indifferent to her agony. She whispered, "This can't be real," clutching her chest as the truth clawed deeper. The doctor stood still, a silent shadow in the background, while Sarah's trembling steps carried her closer to the bed. Her eyes fixed on the motionless form beneath the sheets, searching desperately for any sign of life, any hint of movement. She remembered their last laugh together, the warmth of his hand in hers, the way his voice steadied her when fear threatened to drown her. Now, all she saw was stillness, and the silence screamed louder than any cry. She reached the bedside, her hand hovering above his, unable to bridge the cruel distance. "Wake up," she pleaded softly, voice cracking, but the air remained heavy, merciless in its silence. Sarah's knees bent as she sank into the chair beside the bed, her body folding as though the weight of grief had stolen her strength. Her hand finally brushed his, skin cold, unyielding, nothing like the warmth she remembered. She gasped, a sound sharp and broken, and pressed her forehead against their joined hands. "You promised me forever," she whispered, her voice strangled with disbelief. The monitors around her beeped faintly, sterile echoes mocking her pain. She tried to inhale, but every breath felt too heavy, her chest tightening like it could never release the ache. The doctor quietly stepped back, giving her space, but the silence he left behind was heavier than words. Sarah clutched harder, as if her grip could anchor him back to her, but reality pressed cruelly into her shaking bones. Her tears fell onto his skin, darkening the white sheets, leaving traces of sorrow she couldn't erase. The room felt suspended in time as Sarah's sobs slowed into shallow breaths. Her mind replayed every memory in sharp fragments, the warmth of his laughter, the comfort of his embrace, the promises whispered under starlit skies. She pulled her face away from his hand, her cheeks streaked with tears, her eyes red and swollen. She whispered, "How do I live without you?" The question hung in the sterile air, unanswered, echoing louder than the hum of machines. She brushed her fingers over his lifeless palm, trying to remember the way it once clutched hers so tightly. Each touch felt like a cruel reminder that he was already gone. Her body slumped against the bed, weary from sorrow, her voice trembling as she begged the silence for mercy. The doctor lingered near the door, his voice low as he said, "Take your time." Sarah didn't look at him, her gaze locked on the stillness before her. She shook her head slowly, whispering, "There's no time left." Her voice cracked, breaking into a sob she could not contain. She pressed her cheek against the sheets, desperate to feel something, warmth, heartbeat, anything but the crushing emptiness. Memories pressed in harder, like ghosts filling the room, mocking her with what she had lost. She closed her eyes, picturing his smile, hearing the echo of his voice. But when she opened them, there was only silence. She whispered, "I don't know how to let go," her words dissolving into tears, swallowed by the sterile, merciless air. The night outside the hospital pressed against the glass like a heavy shadow, but Sarah barely noticed as she sat silently, her hands clasped together. The ache inside her chest grew sharper with every heartbeat. She whispered, "Why does the world keep moving when mine has stopped?" The doctor had left her alone, the echoes of his footsteps fading into the corridor. Her eyes drifted toward the bed, unable to look away from the lifeless form. Memories flickered like cruel flashes. His smile in the morning, the warmth of his voice, the way he once reached for her hand in crowded rooms. She shook her head as if to silence the storm in her mind, but the memories only grew louder. The room smelled of antiseptic and sorrow, an air too sterile for love to survive. Sarah leaned forward, pressing her forehead into her clasped hands, her voice trembling as she whispered, "I don't know who I am without you." Sarah forced herself to stand, her legs weak beneath her weight, as though grief itself chained her down. She moved closer to the window, the city lights beyond glowing faintly against the night. She whispered, "How can the world shine when mine has gone dark?" Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, eyes red, cheeks streaked with tears, shoulders heavy with despair. She touched the window with trembling fingers, searching for comfort in the cold glass. In the silence, she remembered the first time they had walked through the city together, the laughter spilling between them like music. Now, the same lights mocked her emptiness, glowing without meaning. Her voice cracked as she said, "You were my home, and now I'm lost." The words broke inside her chest, heavy and unrelenting. She let her forehead rest against the glass, surrendering to the heaviness pressing against her soul. The chair creaked as Sarah lowered herself again, exhaustion weighing down her body. She closed her eyes, but the darkness only sharpened the pain. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "I can still hear you laughing." She pressed her palm against her chest, as though holding her heart together before it shattered. Her mind played back the way he once held her close, his arms a shield against the chaos of the world. She wanted to believe he was still here, that if she closed her eyes hard enough, she would feel him again. But all she felt was emptiness. She turned toward the bed, her throat tightening as she whispered, "Why didn't I tell you enough how much I needed you?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, leaving her hollow. Tears fell silently down her face, dripping onto her cardigan, each drop a confession of her breaking soul. The silence weighed heavier as the night deepened, broken only by Sarah's uneven breaths. She shifted closer to the bedside, her fingers grazing over the sheet, covering his still body. She whispered, "I thought love could protect us." The words faltered, dissolving into sobs as her throat tightened. She pressed her hand against the blanket, remembering how he once pulled her into his arms, warm and strong, whispering that they would face everything together. Now she faced it all alone. Her chest heaved as she cried, her voice raw as she murmured, "You were supposed to stay." The memories clashed with the cruel reality before her eyes, a war she could not win. She bowed her head against the bed, body trembling, surrendering to sorrow that felt endless and merciless. The hours dragged mercilessly, the sterile clock ticking on the wall like an unfeeling witness to her despair. Sarah wiped her face with shaking hands, her eyes swollen but still drawn to the figure lying motionless before her. She whispered, "I don't know how to leave you." The weight of the words pressed into her chest, suffocating her as the night crept further into silence. She pulled her chair closer, gripping his hand beneath the sheet, her fingers curling around his as though refusing to let go. "You were my everything," she murmured, her voice fading into sobs. Her body leaned forward, resting against the bed, her tears soaking into the sheets once again. The stillness of the room mocked her fragile hope, leaving her broken, her world collapsing quietly in the cold light of the hospital. The morning sun tried to pierce through the hospital blinds, but the room felt colder than night. Sarah sat motionless, her hair messy, her face pale from sleepless hours. She whispered, "I thought time would stop with you." The truth struck harder, as she realized the world outside continued without mercy. A nurse entered quietly, placing a chart at the foot of the bed, her eyes lowered in quiet respect. Sarah didn't look up, her gaze fixed on the stillness before her. She remembered how mornings once meant his laughter over coffee, the sound of music filling their kitchen, the warmth of his touch brushing her hair back. Now, the silence was a cruel mirror of all she had lost. Her throat tightened as she whispered, "I can't bear this." The words crumbled, spilling into the sterile air like broken glass. Sarah stepped into the hallway, her legs unsteady as she clutched the wall for balance. The corridor stretched endlessly, the distant sound of footsteps echoing like reminders of a life that moved on without her. She whispered, "I don't belong anywhere anymore." She passed families sitting with tired hope, others weeping with grief, each face a reflection of her own fractured heart. Her chest ached as she recalled how she once believed love could shield her from pain. Now she saw only fragility, life hanging by threads that snapped without warning. Her eyes burned, but she forced herself to keep walking, as though movement might quiet the storm raging inside her. She muttered, "I can't carry this alone," her voice breaking against the hollow walls, lost in the echoes of despair. She returned to the room and collapsed into the chair once more, her hands trembling as she covered her face. The silence pressed against her ears until she whispered, "Why does it hurt more with every hour?" Her body shook with sobs she could not contain, her breath uneven and shallow. She reached for his hand again, desperate for connection, pressing her lips against his cold skin. "I can't lose you like this," she pleaded, her words choked and desperate. The memories of his promises filled her mind, words of forever, dreams of tomorrow, all shattered before her eyes. She lowered her head, tears spilling without end, her grief growing louder in the stillness. She whispered again, weaker this time, "Please don't leave me." The words dissolved into the empty air, unanswered, merciless. The door opened softly, and her closest friend stepped in, carrying quiet concern etched into her face. Rachel whispered, "You shouldn't go through this alone." Sarah shook her head, her voice trembling, "There's no one else who can understand." Rachel approached cautiously, kneeling beside her, eyes shimmering with empathy. "I can sit with you," she offered, placing her hand on Sarah's shoulder. Sarah's tears fell faster, the weight of her grief cracking open under the touch of comfort. She whispered, "I'm breaking," her voice raw. Rachel squeezed her shoulder, whispering back, "Then let me hold the pieces with you." The words cracked Sarah's composure, and she buried her face into her friend's embrace, sobs muffled but heavy. The silence of grief shared between them filled the sterile room, fragile yet powerful. Hours blurred into each other, the weight of grief stretching time into something unending. Sarah sat between silence and sobs, Rachel still by her side, steady but quiet. Sarah whispered, "It feels like I'm drowning." Rachel nodded softly, her voice low. "Then let me be the shore you hold on to." Sarah closed her eyes, the words settling into her heart like fragile lifelines. She clutched Rachel's hand, her voice unsteady as she murmured, "I don't want to be alone." Rachel squeezed back, steady and warm, whispering, "You're not." The moment cracked Sarah's grief just enough to let a flicker of strength inside. For the first time since it began, she breathed deeper, her sobs easing slightly. Yet the sorrow still lingered, heavy and vast, a reminder that her journey through loss had only begun. The room was quiet, broken only by the faint hum of machines. Sarah leaned against the bedside, her hand still wrapped around his. She whispered, "I thought love was enough." Rachel shifted in her seat, her eyes fixed on the floor. The silence between them thickened, pressing heavily into the sterile space. Sarah glanced at her friend, searching her face, sensing something unsaid. Rachel's lips trembled as she finally whispered, "There's something you need to know." Sarah's chest tightened, her breath caught, fear clawing its way up her throat. Rachel's voice cracked as she continued, "He wasn't honest with you. There were things he kept hidden." The words cut through Sarah like a blade. Her body stiffened, her hands slipping slightly from his. She whispered, "No, not now." The truth she wasn't ready for lingered in the air, threatening to shatter what little strength she had left. Sarah turned sharply, her eyes blazing through tears, her voice sharp. "What are you talking about?" Rachel's gaze fell, her shoulders shaking as she whispered, "He loved you, but he carried secrets, debts, choices he never told you." Sarah's stomach twisted, her world cracking open wider than before. The silence of the hospital was suffocating as her breath came shallow, unsteady. She whispered, "No, he promised me honesty." Rachel nodded, her eyes glistening. "I wanted to tell you before, but I couldn't. He made me swear." Sarah's chest heaved as anger and grief tangled into one unbearable ache. She turned back to the still figure, her hand trembling violently as she whispered, "How could you?" The room tilted around her, reality colliding with betrayal, grief doubled into something unbearable. Sarah stumbled back, pressing her palm to her forehead, her voice trembling. "You mean I never really knew him?" Rachel shook her head, whispering, "You knew his heart, but not his battles." Sarah's body shook, her chest tightening until she could barely breathe. The man she had clung to as her anchor had carried secrets that now felt like chains dragging her down. She looked at him, her tears blurring the edges of his still form. "You lied to me," she whispered, her voice cracking, torn between rage and despair. Memories of laughter and promises shattered like broken glass in her mind, cutting deep. She turned toward Rachel, her voice sharp. "Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me?" Rachel's tears fell as she whispered, "Because he begged me not to." The truth weighed down like a stone, crushing Sarah's heart further into the void. The silence after the revelation was unbearable, every breath filled with betrayal. Sarah leaned against the wall, her body shaking, her voice hoarse as she whispered, "Everything I believed was a lie." Rachel reached toward her, whispering, "No, he loved you. That was never a lie." Sarah turned, her tears falling faster, her voice breaking. "Then why did he hide himself from me?" The walls of the room seemed to close in, the air thick with sorrow and truth. She pressed her fists against her chest, whispering, "I gave him all of me." Rachel's face softened with grief as she whispered, "He was afraid. Afraid of losing you if you knew." Sarah's heart cracked deeper, rage and sorrow tangled into one unbearable storm. Her scream broke the silence, raw and uncontainable, echoing through the sterile halls. Sarah collapsed to her knees, the weight of loss and betrayal pressing her down. Her voice cracked as she cried, "He left me with nothing but lies and silence." Rachel knelt beside her, her hand resting gently on her back, whispering, "He loved you in the only way he knew how." Sarah shook her head violently, sobs tearing from her throat. The image of him, once her protector, now felt shattered, broken by secrets she never asked for. Her heart, already broken by death, now bled from betrayal. She whispered, "I don't know if I can forgive him," the words heavy and raw. Rachel held her tighter, whispering, "Then don't forgive now, just breathe." The advice hung in the air, fragile but grounding. Sarah closed her eyes, gasping for air, clinging to the edge of a grief that threatened to consume her whole. The night grew darker, but the storm inside Sarah raged louder. She stood at the foot of the bed, her voice trembling. "Why did you leave me with this truth?" Her chest heaved as she stared at his lifeless face, torn between love and rage. Rachel stayed near the doorway, silent, giving her space. Sarah's tears streamed as her voice cracked. "I loved you with everything I had." The words tasted like blood in her throat. She slammed her fists against the metal railing of the bed, her sobs echoing against the walls. The pain, the betrayal, the endless silence, it all erupted in one raw release. Her knees shook, but she refused to collapse this time. She whispered, "I deserve the truth." The words rang heavy in the sterile room, an accusation, a plea, and a scream all at once. Sarah's anger burned hotter than her grief, each tear a spark of fury. She leaned over the bed, her voice shaking as she hissed, "You promised me forever, and you left me drowning in lies." Her trembling hand pressed against his chest, but there was no heartbeat, no warmth to answer. Her sobs choked her, each one pulling her deeper into despair. She screamed, raw and loud, her voice cutting through the sterile silence like shattered glass. The weight of every sacrifice, every memory, every secret fell on her shoulders at once. Her voice cracked as she whispered, Why wasn't I enough for you to trust? The question hung like a curse in the room, echoing back to her in unbearable silence. Rachel stepped forward, her voice trembling. Sarah, please, don't destroy yourself with this. Sarah turned sharply, her eyes wild with grief, shouting, he destroyed me first. The force of her words shook the room. Even Rachel flinched at the rawness. Sarah's sobs consumed her, her knees buckling until she collapsed into the chair again. She buried her face in her hands, whispering, I don't know how to live without him. Rachel knelt beside her, whispering softly, you're still here, you still breathe. Sarah shook her head violently, her voice muffled through her hands. But I don't want to. The confession hung like smoke in the air. Heavy, dangerous, and painfully honest. Rachel's voice steadied as she whispered, if you give up, then his love really dies. You carry it now. Sarah's sobs slowed, her chest heaving, her mind torn between rage and despair. She lifted her face, eyes swollen, whispering, how do I carry a love built on lies? Rachel held her gaze, whispering, because even broken love is still love. Sarah stared at the still figure, her body trembling, her voice cracking. Then why does it feel like it's killing me? Rachel took her hand, firm and steady, whispering, because grief is heavy, but it won't crush you forever. Sarah's tears fell again, softer now, her breath uneven but deeper than before. Her heart still bled, but something fragile flickered within the pain, an echo of survival. The room fell silent once more, but Sarah's breathing steadied, her chest rising and falling with shaky control. She leaned forward, brushing her fingertips across the sheets, whispering, I loved you with everything I had, even if you couldn't give me the truth. Her tears dripped softly onto the blanket, not with fury this time, but with aching sorrow. Rachel remained beside her, silent, offering quiet strength. Sarah's voice cracked as she whispered, I don't forgive you yet, but I can't stop loving you. The words carried both anger and tenderness, colliding into a painful truth. Her body trembled as she let the silence settle, not fighting it, but surrendering to it. For the first time, she allowed herself to grieve without resistance. Her sobs softened into quiet whimpers, her voice barely audible as she whispered, goodbye. The morning light spilled softly through the blinds, warmer than the nights before, though the weight of grief still clung to Sarah's shoulders. She sat beside the bed, her voice quiet. I don't know if I'll ever be whole again. Rachel, sitting close, touched her arm gently, whispering, you don't need to be whole yet, just breathe. Sarah's gaze stayed fixed on the figure beneath the sheets, her chest rising in uneven breaths, the ache still deep, but no longer consuming every ounce of her strength. For the first time, she did not resist the stillness. She let it surround her. Her voice cracked as she whispered, maybe healing isn't forgetting. Maybe it's learning to carry the pain differently. The thought was fragile, but it felt like the beginning of something new, however small. Later that morning, Sarah walked slowly into the hallway, her cardigan pulled tightly around her shoulders. The world beyond the hospital walls felt overwhelming, but for the first time she allowed herself to look at it. She whispered, life is still moving. People passed by, some laughing, some crying, each wrapped in their own stories. She realized that grief was not only hers, though hers felt heavier than the air she breathed. She pressed her hand to her chest, whispering, I'm still here. The words were shaky, uncertain, but real. She turned her eyes toward the window at the far end of the corridor, where sunlight spilled in, reminding her that even in despair, light still existed. Rachel walked beside Sarah, quiet but steady, her presence grounding. Sarah's voice trembled as she said, I don't think I can go back to the life I had before. Rachel nodded softly, replying, maybe you don't need to. Maybe this is the start of a new one. The thought terrified Sarah, her heart tightening, yet deep down she knew Rachel was right. She wiped her face with shaking hands, whispering, I don't know who I am without him. Rachel placed her hand on Sarah's shoulder, whispering gently, then this is where you begin to find out. The words struck deep, painful but strangely liberating, like opening a locked door she had feared to touch. They stepped outside together, the crisp morning air brushing against Sarah's face. She inhaled deeply, the scent of rain lingering from the night before. She whispered, "It feels strange to breathe without him." Rachel squeezed her hand, whispering, "But you are breathing." Sarah nodded, her chest aching, but she allowed the truth to settle in. Cars passed, people hurried by, the city alive while she stood in the stillness of grief. Yet in that moment, she realized she was part of that life too. She whispered, "Maybe I can survive this." The words were soft, uncertain, but they carried the fragile strength of someone willing to try. As they walked away from the hospital, Sarah looked back one last time, her eyes lingering on the windows glowing in the morning sun. She whispered, "Goodbye, not just to him, but to the life she had clung to." The weight of grief still pressed heavy, but within it was a faint thread of strength she hadn't felt before. Rachel walked beside her, silent, steady, offering presence instead of answers. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, whispering, "I'll never stop loving you, but I'll try to live." The promise was fragile, but it was enough to take the first step. And so she did, her feet carrying her forward into a world she feared but needed to face. The apartment felt hollow when Sarah stepped inside, the silence pressing against her. She set her bag down, her eyes sweeping across the room, filled with remnants of their life together. She whispered, "Every corner remembers you." The photographs on the shelves, the jacket still hanging by the door, the books stacked carelessly, all spoke of a presence that was now only memory. Sarah touched the frame of a picture, her fingers trembling as she whispered, "I don't know how to keep going without you." Her tears fell, but this time she let them come freely, no longer fighting their weight. The grief was sharp, but within it flickered a strange comfort, proof of the love that had been real, even if broken. She moved to the couch, sinking into its worn cushions, her hands clutching a pillow as though it could fill the emptiness. She whispered, "You should be here beside me." The quiet mocked her, yet she allowed herself to imagine his voice, his laugh, the warmth of his arm around her. For a fleeting moment it almost felt real. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "I'll carry you with me, even if it breaks me." The words echoed into the hollow apartment, fragile and aching. She buried her face into the pillow, her sobs muffled but steady, letting herself release the pain she had held so tightly inside. Later that night, Sarah sat by the window, staring out at the glowing city lights. Her body felt hollow, her chest still heavy, but her breath came steadier than before. She whispered, "The world is still moving." For the first time, the thought didn't crush her. She pressed her hand to the glass, her reflection staring back with red eyes and swollen cheeks. She whispered, "I'll learn to move too, one day." The words were faint but carried the fragile truth of survival. She closed her eyes, imagining his smile, his voice, his touch, letting herself hold him in memory rather than in flesh. She moved to the bedroom, where the bed still held the faint trace of his presence. Sitting on the edge, she pressed her hands to the sheets, whispering, "I loved you more than I knew how to say." Her tears spilled, soaking the fabric, but she didn't pull away. The grief was no longer an enemy to fight, it was the final gift of love she had to carry. She closed her eyes, whispering, "I'll never stop missing you." The words were both a wound and a promise. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders, curling into the emptiness, her body trembling but calmer than before. Sleep hovered near, fragile but merciful. As dawn broke, Sarah stirred awake, the pale light slipping across her face. She sat upright slowly, her eyes red but calm. She whispered, "I'll carry you with me." The words felt like a vow, quiet but unshakable. She stood, moving toward the window, watching the first rays of sunlight bathe the city in soft gold. For the first time, she felt the weight of grief not only as sorrow but also as proof of love. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "I loved you, I still do, and I always will." She closed her eyes, letting the morning light warm her face, a fragile peace settling into her heart. The silence lingered, but it no longer crushed her. It held her instead, carrying both sorrow and strength into the day ahead.